"Do not touch those herbs," the young woman cried, her voice trembling just as the Alpha King's heavy boot crushed the last bundle beneath his feet. The brittle green leaves scattered across the forest path, releasing a cloud of sweet fragrance into the cool morning air. For one impossible heartbeat, the entire woodland became perfectly still. Even the birds stopped singing. King Adrian Hawthorne froze where he stood, his sharp blue eyes widening as an unfamiliar scent drifted toward him. It was warm like fresh rain falling across wildflowers after a long winter, gentle yet impossible to ignore. He had traveled through countless kingdoms, stood beside hundreds of alphas and omegas during royal ceremonies, and faced every challenge expected of a ruler, but never once had he encountered a scent that reached directly into his heart before touching his mind. Across from him, Claire Bennett stared at the crushed herbs as though something far more valuable than plants had just been destroyed. The color slowly disappeared from her face. Her hands trembled while she dropped to her knees, desperately gathering broken stems that could no longer be saved. She whispered to herself so quietly that Adrian could barely hear the words. "Not today. Please, not today." Adrian looked down at the ruined bundle. "I did not see them beneath the leaves," he said honestly. "If they were important, I will have every herb in the kingdom replaced before sunset." Claire shook her head immediately. "You cannot replace these." Her answer was almost a whisper, but it carried a sadness that lingered in the cold air longer than the fragrance itself. Adrian frowned. "Why?" She did not answer. Instead, she quickly collected the remaining herbs into her worn basket and stood without meeting his eyes. Her plain cream-colored dress and faded cloak made her look like any ordinary villager gathering medicinal plants before the day's heat arrived. Nothing about her appearance suggested mystery. Nothing explained why the scent surrounding her had suddenly awakened instincts Adrian had never experienced before. A gentle breeze swept through the towering pine trees, carrying the lingering fragrance. Even farther into the forest, Claire noticed it instantly. Fear replaced every trace of disappointment on her face. She tightened her grip around the basket and glanced nervously toward the distant mountains as though expecting someone else to appear. Adrian followed her gaze, but saw only endless woodland stretching beneath the pale morning sky. "Are you hiding from someone?" he asked. Claire hesitated for only a second before forcing a small smile that failed to reach her eyes. "No, Your Majesty. I simply need to leave." She turned quickly and hurried deeper into the forest without another word. Adrian remained where he was, watching her disappear between the ancient trees. Every instinct told him to let her go. Every lesson about respecting another person's privacy urged him to return to the castle. Yet the mysterious fragrance still lingered around him like an unanswered question. He slowly bent down and picked up one unbroken sprig from the crushed bundle. The leaves looked ordinary enough, but when he rubbed them gently between his fingers, almost no scent remained. Whatever had filled the air moments earlier had not belonged to the herbs alone. Adrian stared into the silent forest where Claire had vanished, and for the first time in years, the Alpha King abandoned the road leading home and took a single step toward the unknown, unaware that one careless mistake had uncovered a secret powerful enough to change both their destinies forever. Claire Bennett did not stop running until the ancient forest swallowed every trace of the royal road behind her. The basket of broken herbs bounced against her side with every hurried step, and each breath reminded her that the familiar shield surrounding her scent was disappearing little by little. She finally reached a small stone cottage hidden beneath towering oak trees, a place so deeply covered by climbing vines that even experienced hunters often passed without noticing it. The moment she closed the wooden door behind her, she hurried toward a long table covered with drying herbs, carefully separating every remaining leaf that had survived the morning. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, but her hands refused to stop trembling. "It is not enough," she whispered to herself. "There is not enough left." She reached for several glass jars filled with lavender, mountain sage, and crushed pine needles, blending them together in hopes of recreating the protective mixture that had hidden her true scent for years. The fragrance slowly filled the cottage, but she immediately recognized the painful truth. It was weaker than before, much weaker. Outside, several birds suddenly took flight from the nearby trees. Claire instinctively looked through the small window, expecting strangers to emerge from the forest. Instead, She saw only the distant outline of King Adrian Hawthorne walking alone along the narrow trail she had taken minutes earlier. He was not following with the urgency of a hunter. He walked slowly, carefully studying the ground, the broken plants, and every small detail she had unknowingly left behind. Adrian should have returned to the castle before noon. Instead, curiosity refused to release him. Every lesson he had learned as king warned him against interfering in the private life of an ordinary woman. Yet nothing about Claire Bennet felt ordinary anymore. Her frightened expression lingered in his thoughts more vividly than the mysterious scent itself. She had not reacted like someone protecting expensive medicine. She had reacted like someone watching the last wall guarding a dangerous secret collapse in front of her eyes. Adrian knelt beside a patch of flattened grass, where Claire had briefly stopped during her escape. Among the scattered leaves rested another small sprig from the ruined herbs. This time he examined it more carefully. The plant itself carried almost no remarkable fragrance. It certainly could not have produced the extraordinary scent that still echoed in his memory. His gaze slowly lifted toward the distant cottage partially hidden among the trees. Thin gray smoke drifted from the chimney, carrying faint traces of fresh herbs into the afternoon breeze. "What are you hiding?" he murmured quietly. At that very moment, Claire stepped outside carrying several bundles of newly gathered plants. She never noticed Adrian standing hundreds of feet away between the trees. Instead of resting after her exhausting morning, she immediately began planting fresh seedlings around the cottage with patient determination. Every movement revealed urgency rather than routine. Adrian watched as she surrounded the tiny home with circles of carefully chosen herbs, creating what almost looked like an invisible boundary. The sight only deepened the mystery. No ordinary villager would spend years cultivating such an unusual collection unless every single plant served a greater purpose. As the sun slowly lowered across the forest, Adrian quietly turned away before Claire could discover him. He had entered the woods believing he might have accidentally ruined valuable medicine. He left with an entirely different suspicion. Whatever Claire Bennet was protecting had nothing to do with healing flowers. Somewhere beneath those ordinary leaves rested a truth powerful enough to make a gentle young woman live as though every passing breeze could change her entire life. And for reasons he could not yet explain, the Alpha King found himself determined to uncover that truth before someone else did. That night, the little stone cottage remained dark except for the soft glow of a single lantern resting beside Claire Bennet's work table. One by one, she laid the surviving herbs across clean linen, carefully separating healthy leaves from the crushed stems King Adrian Hawthorne had accidentally destroyed. Every movement followed a routine she had repeated since childhood. Dry the mountain sage. Crush the silver fern. Mix the lavender only after sunset. Never allow the fragrance to grow too strong. Never allow it to disappear completely. As she worked, her fingers paused over a faded leather pouch tucked beneath the table. She slowly untied the worn cord and removed a tiny pressed flower that had long since lost its color. For a moment, she simply stared at it, and memories she had spent years burying quietly returned. She remembered another cottage hidden deep within another forest. She remembered her mother's gentle smile as she patiently taught a little girl how to recognize every healing plant by its leaves rather than its flowers. More importantly, she remembered the lesson repeated every spring. These herbs are not only medicine, her mother would always whisper while planting fresh seedlings beneath the morning sun. For women like us, they are freedom. Promise me you will never stop growing them. At 7 years old, Claire had never understood those words. She believed every family spent their afternoons tending fragrant gardens. She believed every little girl carried woven baskets into the woods before sunrise. Only years later did she discover the painful truth. Her mother had never planted herbs because she loved gardening. She planted them because each rare leaf softened the natural scent of an omega, allowing them to live quietly without drawing unwanted attention from strangers who valued rare gifts more than ordinary lives. Claire closed her eyes as the memory faded. Her mother had never spoken with bitterness. She had simply hoped her daughter might someday choose her own future instead of having one chosen for her. That hope became the promise Claire carried every day. She carefully wrapped the faded flower inside the pouch again before returning to the unfinished mixture spread across the table. Outside, the wind rustled through the tall pines, carrying distant sounds from the sleeping forest. Claire stepped onto the porch and looked toward the stars. The familiar herbal fragrance still surrounded the cottage, but faint spaces had begun appearing within it. Invisible cracks. She could feel them even if no one else could. Several miles away, Adrian stood alone inside the highest tower of the royal castle, unable to sleep. His advisors believed he had returned late because official business had delayed his journey. He never corrected them. Instead, he found himself standing beside an open window, allowing the cool night air to drift through the chamber. Yet no matter how deeply he breathed, his thoughts returned to the strange fragrance hidden beneath the ordinary herbs. It lingered in his memory with remarkable clarity, refusing to fade like every other scent he had encountered throughout his life. Adrian crossed to the royal library where countless volumes recorded the customs, traditions, and forgotten histories of neighboring kingdoms. Candlelight flickered across ancient pages as he searched for any mention of herbs capable of concealing natural scents. Hours passed before an old handwritten journal caught his attention. Between faded lines describing mountain plants appeared a single sentence written by an unknown scholar decades earlier. Some rare herbal blends were believed to soften the natural scent of gifted omegas, protecting them from unwanted discovery during uncertain times. Adrian read the sentence twice before quietly closing the journal. Outside his window, the first breeze before dawn carried the fragrance of fresh pine across the kingdom, while deep inside the forest Claire planted another circle of herbs around her tiny home, unaware that the secret her mother had spent a lifetime protecting had already begun opening its first silent door. Morning sunlight spilled across the royal courtyard, but King Adrian Hawthorne barely noticed the bustle of servants preparing for another day inside the castle. His thoughts remained trapped in the quiet forest where Claire Bennett had vanished. During the council meeting, he answered every question with calm precision, signed every document placed before him, and listened to every report from neighboring territories. Yet his attention wandered each time the memory of that extraordinary fragrance returned. When the meeting finally ended, Adrian declined the invitation to join his advisors for the customary afternoon haunt. Instead, he quietly crossed the castle library and descended a narrow staircase leading into the oldest archive beneath the palace. Dust rested thick upon shelves untouched for generations, and countless journals recorded forgotten customs from kingdoms that no longer existed. Adrian searched patiently through faded records describing rare herbs, traveling healers, and ancient traditions surrounding Alpha and Omega families. Most entries spoke only of folklore, but one collection of handwritten letters repeatedly mentioned periods long ago when some Omegas chose isolation rather than life inside powerful packs. According to the letters, a few families had cultivated special herbal gardens that softened natural scents, allowing them to travel without attracting constant attention. The writings never described those women as dangerous. Instead, they described them as peaceful people who simply wished to choose their own futures. Adrian slowly closed the final letter and remained silent. Everything he had witnessed inside the forest suddenly appeared in a different light. Claire had never shown fear because he had crushed valuable medicine. She had feared losing the quiet life she had worked so carefully to protect. At nearly the same hour, Claire knelt beside another small patch of fresh herbs behind her cottage. She gently pressed new seedlings into the rich soil before watering each one with careful patience. Every empty space left by the destroyed plants reminded her how fragile safety could become after a single careless moment. She glanced toward the surrounding trees more often than usual, listening to every breeze and every distant bird call. Nothing seemed unusual, yet she could not silence the uneasy feeling growing inside her heart. Late that afternoon, an elderly traveling merchant stopped beside her garden, carrying a weathered wooden cart filled with seeds and simple household goods. Claire greeted him warmly and offered cool water before he continued his journey. The old man smiled kindly as always, but this time his expression carried quiet concern. "People are talking," he said softly. Some travelers passing through the villages claimed they noticed an unfamiliar fragrance drifting from these woods several mornings ago. Most dismissed it as wildflowers, but not everyone did. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken, although she kept her voice calm. Travelers often imagine strange things. The merchant nodded slowly. "Perhaps, Still, you should be careful. Curiosity has a way of spreading faster than truth. After he disappeared along the forest road, Claire stood motionless beside the garden until the evening shadows stretched across the clearing. Far away, Adrian mounted his horse once again. This time he carried no royal banner and wore no ceremonial cloak, choosing plain riding clothes instead of clothing that would announce the arrival of a king. He was no longer searching because of curiosity alone. He needed to understand whether Claire Bennett had spent years hiding from fear or from something far more dangerous. As the first stars appeared above the forest, Adrian guided his horse toward the hidden cottage once more, unaware that someone else had already begun following the same quiet trail for reasons neither he nor Claire could yet imagine. The moon had already risen above the towering pines when King Adrian Hawthorne reached the edge of the hidden clearing once again, but this time he did not step forward. He remained beneath the shelter of the trees, careful not to disturb the quiet evening surrounding Claire Bennett's small cottage. A warm glow escaped through the windows while gentle wisps of fragrant steam drifted from the chimney, blending naturally with the scent of the surrounding forest. Adrian watched as Claire carried several baskets of herbs from the garden inside, moving with calm determination despite the worry that still lingered across her face. She looked over her shoulder more than once before closing the door, as though expecting someone to emerge from the darkness. Adrian understood that fear now. He no longer believed she was hiding because she had done something wrong. She was hiding because she believed someone would eventually come searching. As the cottage settled into silence, Adrian quietly walked around the outer edge of the garden. Hundreds of carefully arranged herbs surrounded the home in overlapping circles, each planted with remarkable precision. Lavender stood beside mountain sage, silver fern beside woodland mint, and between every row grew several plants described in the ancient journals he had studied only hours earlier. They were not random at all. Together, they formed a living barrier that softened the scent carried by the wind. Adrian slowly knelt beside one of the gardens, gently brushing his fingertips across the leaves without damaging them. Everything finally began fitting together. Claire had not spent years creating a beautiful garden. She had spent years building an invisible sanctuary. Every flower, every root, every carefully measured distance between the plants existed for one purpose alone. They allowed her to disappear into an ordinary life. A sudden sound interrupted his thoughts. Soft footsteps approached along the narrow forest trail. Adrian immediately stepped deeper into the shadows, just as two unfamiliar travelers appeared beyond the clearing. Their clothing suggested they were merchants passing through the region, but instead of continuing down the road, they paused and lifted their heads as though searching for something carried by the breeze. One quietly remarked, "It faded again. I thought I noticed something unusual yesterday." The other nodded before answering, "Probably wildflowers. We have wasted enough daylight chasing stories." They continued walking until the forest swallowed them once more. Adrian waited several moments before emerging again. Those strangers had noticed something despite the herbs still protecting the cottage. Claire's precautions were beginning to fail. At dawn the following morning, Claire left home carrying only a small basket and headed toward a distant meadow where several rare plants grew beside a quiet stream. She knew she needed ingredients that could not be found near the cottage. Without them, the protective blend would continue weakening. She carefully harvested each stem before stopping beside the water to wash the fresh roots. As she stood, an unexpected voice spoke gently from behind her. "You came back for stronger herbs." Claire turned immediately. Adrian stood several yards away with empty hands, making no effort to move closer. His expression held neither suspicion nor authority. It carried only quiet understanding. Claire lowered her eyes. "Some things cannot be replaced with ordinary plants." Adrian nodded slowly. "I know." She looked up in surprise. Before she could speak, Adrian continued in the same calm voice. "I spent the night reading old records. Those gardens around your home are not simply for healing. They protect your scent." Silence settled between them as the nearby stream flowed peacefully over smooth stones. Claire realized there was no shock in his eyes anymore, only compassion. The secret she had guarded for so many years was no longer hidden behind misunderstanding. For the first time since their paths crossed, Adrian saw not a mystery to solve, but a woman carrying the quiet weight of a promise made long before either of them had ever met. Claire Bennett remained perfectly still beside the quiet stream, her basket of freshly gathered herbs resting at her feet, while the gentle sound of flowing water filled the silence between them. She searched King Adrian Hawthorne's face, expecting questions, suspicion, or even judgment. Instead, she found only patience. "You should leave," she said softly after several long moments. "The less you know about me, the safer you will be." Adrian slowly shook his head. "I believe the opposite has become true." Before Claire could answer, a sudden gust of wind swept across the meadow, bending the tall grass and scattering the sweet fragrance rising from the fresh herbs inside her basket. Claire's expression changed instantly. She turned toward the western ridge where the breeze continued climbing into the hills beyond the forest. "That wind was too strong," she whispered. Adrian noticed genuine fear returning to her eyes. "What happened?" Claire looked down at the herbs she had collected. The blend was not finished. Without the final mixture, the scent travels farther than it should. Adrian listened carefully as another breeze carried the faint fragrance across the open meadow. It was subtle, but now that he understood what he was sensing, he realized how easily someone else might notice it under the right conditions. Several miles away, three travelers guiding their horses along an old trade route unexpectedly slowed their pace. One of them raised his head toward the forest. "Do you smell that?" he asked quietly. The oldest among them frowned. Only for a moment. The youngest rider smiled uncertainly. "Perhaps flowers." The older man remained thoughtful before urging his horse forward again. "Perhaps. Or perhaps the wind is carrying an old memory." Back beside the stream, Claire hurriedly placed fresh herbs over the open basket, trying to soften the lingering fragrance before it drifted. Any farther, Adrian stepped closer, stopping several feet away to avoid making her uncomfortable. "Tell me what you need," he said. "If there is a way to restore the garden, I will help." Claire gave a faint, weary smile. "You already tried to help once. That is how all of this began." Adrian lowered his eyes briefly before answering. "Then allow me to correct my mistake." His quiet sincerity caught her completely by surprise. She had expected a king to defend his actions or command obedience. Instead, he accepted responsibility without hesitation. Before Claire could respond, a familiar voice echoed from the nearby path. The elderly merchant who had visited her cottage the day before emerged from between the trees, leading his weathered cart. Relief crossed his face when he saw Claire unharmed, but it quickly faded as he noticed Adrian standing nearby. The old man bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty." Adrian returned the greeting with a polite nod. The merchant hesitated before speaking again. "I came because more strangers have entered the villages this morning. They claim they are simply passing through, but they have asked unusual questions about rare plants and unusual fragrances in these woods." Claire quietly closed her eyes. The rumors were spreading faster than she had feared. Adrian looked toward the distant hills where the afternoon wind continued carrying the scent beyond the trees. In that moment, he understood something far more important than ancient traditions or forgotten records. Claire was not running from one person. She was trying to stay ahead of growing curiosity that could eventually reach anyone willing to follow whispers instead of facts. Adrian turned back to her with calm determination. "You should not have to face that alone." Claire met his eyes for a long moment, uncertain whether she could trust the promise of a king she had known for only a few days. Yet beneath the fear, another unfamiliar feeling quietly appeared for the first time in years. It was not certainty. It was hope, small and fragile, like the first green leaf pushing through the soil after a long winter, waiting to discover whether the coming season would finally allow it to grow. King Adrian Hawthorne rode back to the castle before sunset, with a decision already forming in his mind. The forest behind him grew quiet once more, but he knew the silence would not last. Rumors had already begun traveling beyond the trees, carried from village to village by innocent conversations and curious strangers who believed they were chasing little more than an unusual story. By the time Adrian entered the great hall, his council was already waiting. Several noble advisors rose respectfully as he approached the long oak table. Maps, reports, and sealed letters covered its polished surface. One advisor stepped forward and bowed. "Your Majesty, travelers from the Western Territories have requested permission to search portions of the royal forest. They claim they are studying rare medicinal plants." Adrian recognized the excuse immediately. Their request is denied, he answered calmly. A murmur spread through the chamber. Another advisor looked puzzled. May we ask why? Adrian rested one hand on the back of his chair before speaking. Because the royal forest is no longer open to private expeditions. Effective immediately, no unauthorized searches will be permitted. Several council members exchanged uncertain glances. The oldest among them finally spoke. Your Majesty, this is a sudden change. Some neighboring leaders may question your decision. Adrian met the man's eyes without hesitation. Then they may ask me directly. His steady voice ended the discussion before it could grow into an argument. Meanwhile, Claire Bennett spent the afternoon replanting the newest herbs around her cottage. She carefully placed each seedling into the soil, hoping the fresh growth would strengthen the fading barrier surrounding her home. Although Adrian had promised to help, she still struggled to believe anyone with so much power would truly understand someone who had spent her entire life trying not to be noticed. Even so, she found herself remembering the way he had apologized without pride and listened without demanding answers. It had been many years since anyone had treated her fears as something worthy of respect. As evening settled across the forest, the elderly merchant returned once more, carrying several small sacks tied carefully beneath his cart. He smiled warmly as Claire greeted him. I brought the mountain sage you requested, he said. It took longer to find because nearly every herbalist I visited had already heard the same strange rumors. Claire accepted the bundle with grateful hands. Are the stories becoming worse? The old man nodded slowly. People rarely fear what they understand. They fear mysteries much more. Before Claire could respond, the distant sound of horses echoed through the trees. Her heart tightened. Adrian appeared moments later accompanied by only 2 trusted royal guards who remained respectfully behind him. Instead of carrying weapons or royal banners, the guards unloaded several wooden crates filled with healthy herbs, rich soil, and gardening tools before quietly stepping back. Adrian approached Claire with a gentle smile. You said ordinary plants could not replace what was lost, he said. I believe you were right. So I asked the royal botanists to search for every rare variety described in the oldest records. They found these. Claire looked into the open crates and immediately recognized species she had not seen since childhood. Some had become almost impossible to find. Her eyes slowly filled with tears, she quickly blinked away. Why would you do this? She asked softly. Adrian answered without the slightest hesitation. Because protecting your choice to live peacefully is more important than satisfying another person's curiosity. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the fading light of sunset and the fragrance of newly gathered herbs, Claire realized that the king standing before her had done something no one else had ever done. He had not asked her to trust him first. He had chosen to earn that trust, one thoughtful action at a time. The following morning the forest felt different. The familiar calm that had protected Claire Bennett for years was slowly giving way to an uneasy stillness, as though the trees themselves sensed that change had already begun. Together, she and King Adrian Hawthorne spent the early hours planting the rare herbs he had brought from the royal gardens. Neither of them spoke very much. They worked side by side in quiet rhythm, carefully pressing each young plant into the rich earth, while cool morning sunlight filtered through the towering branches above them. Claire noticed that Adrian never rushed her, never asked another question about her past, and never treated the work as something beneath a king. When the final seedling had been planted, Adrian stood and brushed the soil from his hands before looking across the growing garden. Will these be enough? He asked. Claire studied the newly restored circles of herbs before answering honestly. They will help, but they cannot erase what has already happened. Adrian nodded gently. Then perhaps it is time I understand everything. Claire remained silent for several long moments before leading him toward a weathered wooden bench overlooking the small stream behind the cottage. She carefully removed the faded leather pouch she always carried and placed it between them. Inside rested the tiny pressed flower her mother had preserved years before. Adrian looked at it quietly without touching it. My mother planted the first garden, Claire began softly. She believed every person deserved the chance to decide who they would become. She never wanted her scent to determine her future or mine. She taught me that hiding was never about shame. It was about freedom. She paused as her fingers gently traced the edges of the old flower. When I was young, people often spoke about gifted omegas as though they were prizes waiting to be discovered. Some admired them. Some wished to protect them. Others simply wanted to possess something rare. My mother refused to let anyone make that choice for us. Adrian listened without interrupting. Claire looked toward the quiet stream where sunlight shimmered across the moving water. After she passed away, I promised I would continue planting the gardens she began. Not because I wanted to spend my life hiding, but because I wanted the chance to choose when I stopped. A gentle breeze drifted through the clearing, carrying the fragrance of the newly planted herbs around them. Adrian finally understood the quiet strength he had witnessed from the very beginning. Claire had never hidden because she lacked courage. She had hidden because protecting her independence required courage every single day. You were never afraid of being discovered, Adrian said quietly. You were afraid of losing the right to make your own decisions. Claire slowly nodded. That is the only thing I have ever truly feared. Adrian remained silent for a long moment before speaking again. Then I owe you more than an apology. Claire looked at him with quiet curiosity. Adrian met her eyes with complete sincerity. As your king, I cannot change what happened before we met. But I can make certain that within this kingdom, no person will ever be treated as a possession because of the gifts they were born with. Claire felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest. For years, she had imagined many different endings if someone ever uncovered her secret. None of them had included being understood. None had included someone powerful enough to change the future, choosing compassion over tradition. Above them, the wind gently stirred the fresh herbs, their fragrance blending peacefully with the scent of pine and wildflowers. For the first time since her childhood, Claire allowed herself to imagine a life that was not built upon disappearing. She was not ready to stop protecting herself, but the walls around her heart no longer felt quite as impossible to lower, because sitting beside her was a man who had never asked her to become someone else. He had simply promised that she would always have the freedom to remain herself. Several weeks later, the hidden clearing no longer looked like a place built upon fear. The circles of herbs surrounding Claire Bennett's cottage had grown lush beneath the summer sun, filling the forest with gentle colors and quiet life. Lavender swayed beside mountain sage, while silver ferns stretched across the rich soil where broken stems had once been scattered. Every new leaf stood as proof that even the deepest mistakes could become the beginning of something better when they were met with kindness instead of pride. King Adrian Hawthorne returned often, never with an escort large enough to disturb the peaceful woods, and never with expectations that Claire should become anything other than herself. Sometimes they worked side by side in the gardens. Sometimes they shared quiet conversations beside the stream. Other days, they simply walked through the forest in comfortable silence, discovering that trust was built through ordinary moments repeated with honesty. The rumors that had once spread from village to village gradually faded after Adrian issued a royal decree declaring the protected forests a sanctuary reserved for conservation, healing, and research under the crown. Curious visitors found no reason to wander where they were no longer welcome, and those who questioned the decision received the same calm answer from every royal official. Some places were worth protecting because peace itself was a treasure. As the seasons slowly changed, Adrian introduced another unexpected project throughout the kingdom. Royal gardeners were instructed to cultivate the same rare herbs in public gardens, healing centers, and village squares. People admired the beautiful flowers without realizing they had once represented secrecy and survival. What had belonged to one frightened young woman quietly became a symbol of compassion shared by an entire kingdom. One crisp autumn morning, Adrian arrived carrying a small wooden box carefully carved with intertwining vines. Claire looked at him curiously as he placed it upon the old bench overlooking the stream. Inside rested fresh seeds collected from every rare herb they had planted together during the past several months. "These belong to you," Adrian said gently. Claire smiled. "You brought them all the way from the royal gardens?" Adrian nodded. "No, they came from this garden." Claire looked at the tiny packets in quiet surprise. The herbs she thought she had nearly lost forever had now produced enough seeds to fill countless new gardens. She carefully lifted one packet into her hands, and for the first time she laughed without hesitation. It was a soft sound carried by the autumn breeze, warm enough to make the silent forest feel alive again. Adrian watched her with quiet gratitude. Months earlier he had accidentally destroyed the plants she treasured most. Today, those same gardens had become stronger than either of them had imagined. Claire looked toward the endless rows of herbs glowing beneath the golden sunlight. My mother used to tell me that every seed carried two futures, she said. One remained hidden beneath the ground. The other waited for someone willing to believe it could grow. Adrian smiled gently. She was right. Claire looked at him, her eyes filled not with fear, but with peaceful certainty. I do not think I need to spend my life hiding anymore. Adrian answered with the same quiet sincerity that had first earned her trust beside the stream. You never needed permission to be yourself. You only deserved a place where you could. Together they stood as the afternoon wind moved softly through the flourishing gardens, carrying the fragrance of herbs, wildflowers, and pine across a kingdom that had slowly learned an important truth. Real strength was never measured by power alone. It was revealed by the willingness to protect another person's freedom with humility, compassion, and unwavering respect. And beneath the open sky, Claire finally understood that the greatest gift destiny had given her was not being found by a king, but being seen for exactly who she had always been.